Thanks very much to everybody for coming along. It's so good to see you. Many old friends in the audience, absolutely delightful. And thanks to Tom uh, uh, and John for organizing this great series. So very happy to talk about Herodotus as usual. What you see on the screen there, that picture, some of you may recognize it, is a picture that was used in connection with the film The English Patient, uh, based on the novel by Michael Ondaatje. And that is, of course, Herodotus, text of Herodotus, which follows the Count around through his various travels, and he's constantly dipping into it and making notes. And I want to suggest that this is rather typical of the experience that we all have when we work with Herodotus. I want to start with this quotation. Herodotus is an unaccountable phenomenon in the history of literature, from J.D. Denison's 1952 book, Greek Prose Style. Tom, when he approached me initially, asked if I would sort of give a retrospective of all my work on historiography and mythography and so on. I was a bit reluctant to do that. And I said, well, I've got this paper, which is mostly new, and I'd rather give that. But I said, maybe I could say one or two things about the context of this paper and the ones that went before it. And in a sense, what I've been trying to do all these years working on mythography and historiography is to give some kind of account of Herodotus, to answer the implicit question that Denison poses here. How do we account for him? And my first encounter with Herodotus actually goes back to school days. I remember this quite well, speaking of memories. I was assigned to do a little presentation on the Battle of Marathon. So I read the text and I read authorities on the text, and I didn't understand anything. I just couldn't make head and tail of it. And I kind of got hooked on Herodotus already at that point. Thinking, how do you make sense of this guy? In some ways he seems to be very approachable, and in other ways it seems to be rather alien, which in a way describes a great deal of ancient culture, doesn't it? They're both like us and unlike us. I'm not sure if even after all these years I understand his account of the Battle of Marathon. But certainly with my work on mythography, to simplify enormously, you could say that it's all been done in order to understand Herodotus. Certainly along the way, I've learned a lot about those mythographers and come to appreciate them in their own right. But when I started, that's kind of what I wanted to do with them, was to set some sort of context, because I knew they were out there and people hadn't said anything about them for a long time. And maybe if we looked at them, we could find out something about Herodotus's intellectual and cultural context. This work actually started in 1987. I just published a book on Greek lyric poetry, and I was looking around for a new project, and I had a sabbatical coming up, and I had two ideas. One I thought was a pretty good idea for a book on Euripides, and the other one was to bring up to date the first volume of Jacobi, and I couldn't decide between these. So I phoned up my friend Christopher Brown at the University of Western Ontario, and I said to him, what do you think? I explained my ideas, and he convinced me that the world really didn't need another book on Euripides, at least not for me, and not that one. So I said, all right, I'll do the Kobe thing. So by a kind of accident, stroke of fate, I got going on this project, and it didn't take very long to discover that there were quite different ways of looking at the material that Jacobi had put together, over a century ago. And that's when I began to develop my whole, model about Herodotus and his contemporaries. That was the first piece that arose out of that. It came out in 1996. And if you look at it, I know many of you will be familiar with it, its whole purpose is to try to isolate what is unique about Herodotus. So I came up with the idea of his voice print, and argued that one of the really new things about him is this concern with sources and method, and how he forefronts that in his work. And since then, all the work I've been doing on mythography and historiography is developing that insight and trying to flesh out the background of Herodotus through the mythographers. This paper comes on the back of all that and sums a lot of it up. It's been given in other forms on and off for years now, and I apologize if anybody in the audience has heard some of it before. If some parts of it seem familiar, but as a whole, it is new, and it's going to be one of the new chapters in a book that Moore Ziebeck in Tübingen are going to publish next year, which will include all of my published work on, or most of it, on mythography and historiography, plus a couple of new chapters, and this is one of the new chapters. So Herodotus and the Pleasure of the Text, with apologies to Juan Batz in the title of his famous and sparkling little book. My purpose here could be described simply as trying to assess the balance of orality and literacy in Herodotus, and what it all boils down to is that in the expression orality and literacy, the and is strongly conjunctive, not disjunctive. These two things work together in a way that I don't think has been sufficiently studied. I would argue that criticism, for the most part, has regarded them as in a disjunctive way, that somehow orality and literacy work against each other, or it's a matter of assessing the contribution. This one is more oral than literate, or vice versa. I think on the whole, the balance has been drawn in favor of orality. And so that means that the written version can be regarded as a kind of calque upon some lost oral original, and the focus of attention shifts towards trying to account for those occasions in which Herodotus gave lectures, and rather than the text itself. That performative context is very important, but I would say it doesn't define our text, it simply informs it. Another part of this traditional outlook is that Herodotus is somehow transitional. He is near the beginning of a process which starts out as entirely oral and ends up as entirely literate. And of course, the telos of this particular development, favorite 19th century metaphor, is Thucydides. I want to challenge both of those narratives, both those aspects of the master narrative. A couple of three quotations to illustrate what I mean. The first one from Gregory Crane. Herodotus invented the full-length prose volume, but he had only poetic models for such large-scale composition. Thucydides was successful in part because he understood far better than did Herodotus what subsets of human experience translated well into a freestanding prose text. Herodotus composed a massive script, a book that could be read, but that appeared in an oral world and that was designed for performance. I don't think he did invent the full-length prose volume. He did not have only poetic models for his large-scale composition. He understood perfectly well what he could do with this written book, and it was not designed primarily for performance. It was designed differently, as I'll try to argue tonight. Okay, Simon Slings, it is a platitude to say that Herodotus stands on the watershed between the oral and literate phases of Greek culture. Many idiosyncrasies of his style suggest that he stands in a tradition of telling stories, and that the written language in his time was only in its infancy. This is the first sentence in a chapter. Thucydides, here's Egbert Baker, is a real writer who addresses directly, perhaps for the first time in history, a reading audience. The War of the Peloponnesians and Athenians is a readerly text discourse that's meant for direct ingestion from the written page without the mediation of a reading voice. In this regard, there's a natural contrast between Thucydides and Herodotus's hearerly history, a work that is meant to be heard in performance, displaying many features that are related to the presence of a voice. I would challenge this dichotomy. You can write a book which includes a lot of oral features, right? It could be hearerly work, but written from the get-go. Now, I don't want to, I've learned a lot from all these scholars, and as you see, I'm going to draw on Slings and Baker particularly later in the paper, but I think these quotations illustrate just how embedded this view. It's a platitude to say this, right? Okay. Well, prose writers before and during Herodotus' lifetime, there were a lot of them, and probably many of you have seen the lists that I put together in a couple of different places. The number of people doing ethnography, geography, genealogy, and so on. Before Herodotus and during his lifetime is a very long list. And then also you have to consider the philosophers already in the 6th century, and then more in the 5th century. In Herodotus's day, public oratory was thriving, and there's some evidence that texts were being written down. The medical treatises started to circulate. The philosophy, the sophists were writing their manuals. You get new kinds of works like Ionikios' Epidemiae, and you get inscriptions as well in places like Athens, where they're all over the place. And recent research has argued that the average level of functional literacy was a lot higher than we used to think in a place like Athens. But leaving aside even that aspect of literacy, at a functional level, you have to acknowledge with all of this stuff going on that amongst the elite, there really was a very developed literate culture. They were very literate indeed. And, for the last 60, 70 years, we've been looking at the oral aspects of Greek culture, which is, fantastically rich vein of research, but perhaps we have forgotten that in many ways too, they are amazingly literate. And the question is, how do we arrive at a just evaluation of the working together of oral and literate? Perhaps the first thing to say is that these are not monolithic entities. You don't get all of one and then all of the other. They combine in many different ways, in many different cultures and different historical contexts. And the question is, assessing the particular cultural context and how they work together in that context. They don't necessarily succeed each other in a tidy manner, and literacy never entirely ousts orality. The process can be very messy, may not move in one direction. So that is a general premise. What do we do when we come to contextualize Herodotus? Well, it may depend on where you start. If you start with Homer, who of course is fundamental for a lot of things that Homer does, and you look at his basic purpose of wanting to preserve fame, and the fact that Herodotus calls himself a logios, which can be interpreted as a counterpart of the aoidos, you will be inclined, I think, to put him towards the oral end of the spectrum in this developmental line story from to. And also because the remains of these prosaic predecessors are pretty meager, and they're easy to kind of overlook and to not recognize just how important they were on the intellectual landscape of the day. So if you start from there, you're going to probably wind up with this strong from oral to literate with Herodotus near the beginning of the story. But of course, there's much in Herodotus that does not come from Homer. One thing is the ubiquitous presence of the author, Herodotus, in his text, and you could argue he had the poets or even some of the philosophers like Heraclitus or Parmenides maybe as models for that. As for writing in prose, well, there are all those texts that I've mentioned and flag up here briefly on the slide. If you start from there, you start from those rather than from Homer and the oral background, and you consider the factual, basic, somewhat dry style of the mythographers, you could turn the traditional story on its head and say that Herodotus was putting the oral back into literature and taking texts such as that of Pherecydes and or Hecataeus and building his own very vibrant personality into the text and giving us a sense of his living presence. That's to go the other way, is to put the oral back into the literate. So you could do different things with this, and what I want to do is just look at what the text is like in itself and how we experience that. I hope you'll agree that writing a big book in prose was nothing new. Pherecydes' book was pretty big. There was a lot of prose around. There's also, I should have mentioned, poetic texts, which actually, it's the next slide. Yes, no, where is it? Yes. Oh, how about that? I got this all set up like that. Yeah. In terms of written culture, I mean, you've got all the poetry as well. It's not prose, but it's written, it's circulating. It's a massive amount of texts. So writing and writing a lot was not really such a new idea, but there was still plenty of opportunity to do new things with a big prose work. I argued that one of the new things about Herodotus is the voice print that I mentioned at the outset. I think the scope, the scale of the book, not necessarily just in terms of numbers of pages, but in terms of its omnivorous encyclopedic subject matter, not only mythology and genealogy, but ethnography and geography and history and on and on. So I don't think any book before that we know of was quite so voracious. But tonight I want to say that another aspect, which is probably new, is that the text is just simply fun to read. Okay, it's a sparkling creation. The mythographers have their charms, but they're nothing like the riot that is the Herodotean text. This is the pleasure of the text. It's a unique combination of oral and literate, and that's what I want to try to get at. As Herodotus himself says, and this could serve as the motto of his book, I write what people say. Not just what they say, I believe, but also how they say it. Okay, so so much by way of preliminary. What do I mean when I talk about literacy and orality? Well, just to clarify that, I'm not going to talk about some of the larger cultural aspects one might think of when you think of these terms. So under orality, Herodotus' relationship with his sources and the way that oral tradition changes over time and is affected by who is doing the transmitting and so on. That's very much an aspect of orality, but that's not quite what I'm interested in tonight. On the literate side, if you're looking at literate habits of mind, you might look at such things as Herodotus's interest in chronography and trying to construct a big grid, however problematic it might be in some of its details. This sort of attitude is a literate attitude. His distance from tradition is standing back, taking it. Critical traditions usually called an aspect of literacy. I'm not going to look at those things. I'm just looking at the experience of the text and features of it, which could be described either as literate or as oral. And here's on the literary side, well, of course, there's the fact that he tells us he's writing. He does that 10 times, one way or another. So clearly it is written. The size of the thing, enormous. It might have provided material for lectures, but it can't be considered as the text of a single presentation, and even can't be considered as a stitching together of dozens of such presentations. The implied audience, it's all of the Greeks. It's not written for a particular audience for a particular occasion. It's a transferable text. He writes with the future readership in mind. This Glaucus Classica is often quoted, where he says near the beginning, I'm going to look at big and small cities alike, because those cities which were great long ago for the most part are now small, and those which were great in my time were small before. So you don't use that tense in a live presentation. He's got a future readership in mind. One can argue that his purpose of preserving fame would not be delivered by an oral tradition. There was no network of logioi, quite like there was of the Oidoi epic poems, which all were written down by then anyway, but they could preserve the fiction, at least, that the generations of bards were handing on the poems from Homer. Can't be said of Herodotus' work, so only the written text would deliver that aim. He conceives his work as a monument. That same sentence above comes as a bit of a surprise in context after his poem, and then he says, I'm not going to adjudicate this. What I will do is talk about who first harmed the Greeks, and as I go through my story, I'll talk about great and small alike, because that's a bit of a surprise, really, and it alerts you to the fact that this is you're in for the long haul. It's a monumental work, and you could list here the times when he pronounces principles that apply to the whole of his work. Large-scale cross-references must be placed under this in this list, and the carefully planned structure, of which I could say a great deal. But time marches on, so let's move on to the next page. Indicators of orality to set against this. And here I'm drawing in the work of a lot of people, excellent work. And if anybody wants the references, please get in touch afterwards, and I'll be only too happy to provide them. Okay, so this is sort of linguistic analysis, discourse analysis, and looking for features that are typical of live face-to-face communication. So chunking or fragmentation for ease of comprehension, the chunks correlating to intonation units, as they're called in speech. This is to help rapid online processing of communication. Sequencing your material in a long stretched out line, signposting where you're going, where you've come from, simplification of syntax and signposting with things like anaphoric and cataphoric pronouns, adverbs, repetitions of names, parataxis, linking expressions, precomposition, anacoluthons, typical of oral delivery, repeating narration, which is giving a brief summary followed by a more detailed account, attachment of referent. Stock example of the latter is the climax of the story of Kandali's queen, Kahegune epora min exionta. The position of min shows you that there's a boundary before epora, Vakunako's law. So the way to translate this fully literally would be, and the woman, dash, she sees him as he is leaving. That too is characteristic of oral discourse. Continued, the language of immediacy versus the language of distance. Again, if you want to know where these, who's using these technical terms or inventing this jargon, I can send you the references. So the language of immediacy includes deixis, pointing to things that are, around the participants in the conversation. It often involves a private communication between a small number of people, as opposed to a text like Herodotus, which is Pan-Hellenic. Expressions which indicate interaction with the live audience, spontaneity, that is to say, lack of pre-planning, low in density of information and complexity of syntax, different uses of particles you can add in Greek, some of which are more characteristic of spoken discourse than written. And the ease of processability, this is Alessandro Vatri's work. You can get differences in diction, word order, or types of ambiguity between online, face-to-face, and offline communication. That is to say, offline can be more complicated. It's another way of saying that, but more things come into play here with his analysis of Attic oratory, which is very instructive. In online communication, you get effects of prosody and accentuation, and you get gestures, which can only be inferred from written discourse. Okay. So, how do all of these things go together? Well, one point to make very emphatically is that the extent and the embeddedness and the easy deployment of the oral devices and the variety in their use, the variety in the style and the register in this text suggest a mastery of technique rather than uncertain experimentation and, the result of being a prisoner somewhere on a developmental timeline. As Denniston says, he invented a style which is equal to any demand that he places on it. So depending on what he's trying to do, he will vary his deployment of these many devices. He sometimes uses oral strategies when they're not required, perhaps to slow down a narrative. Even the speeches, the representation of conversation can vary depending on whether it's a private conversation or whether it's a public speech. He can write the strong-on style that's thought to be characteristic of him by ancient orators, where you go and very little subordination, as opposed to the periodic style, which is again exemplified by Thucydides. But he could write good periods if he chose to. And here's a great one. This is the opening of Sophocles' speech when the Spartans are proposing to invade Attica and reinstate the Pisistrates. Truly will the sky be below the earth, and the earth suspended above the sky. Men will have their abode in the sea, and the fishes where men once were. when you, men of Lacedaemon, prepared to bring down the government of equality and restore tyranny to the cities, than which there is nothing in human society more unjust or more blood-soaked. This is a magnificent sentence. It's a model period. In the first part, the tension builds up, and then it is relieved with a snap by the verb paraskuasdiste. And then we have added on to it a lovely clause, which is constructed around a homoteliuton. So it's an excellent example of a period. You can, and it's appropriate to the context. You can just see this Corinthian rising, full of indignation, but also restraint and dignity to address the gravity of the situation. In spite of all that, it's not that difficult to process in Vatry's terms, in terms of online processing, okay, the word order and so on. It would become a bit more complicated if that comparative clause at the end were put after Tyranidas. But it's not. It comes at the end, and it's very easily processed, and yet it's clearly an elaborate, carefully planned sentence, but which is very appropriate to the oral context. So if we consider what's going on here, and this is Herodotus giving us access to this historical occasion and bringing it vividly before our eyes. He has stepped back himself at this point, but he will step back in at the end, and it doesn't take much reflection to realize that this is his artistry at work. Now, this trick of bringing these scenes before our eyes like this, historic scenes, he's learned from Homer. Yeah? But the difference from Homer is that he builds himself into his text. He's there all the time, and we're dealing with his persona all the time. So we're aware of what he's doing as an artist, and we can contemplate that. In that respect, his relationship with these occasions, he's making it clear that he's bringing these occasions to your attention. You could compare him to Pindar. In the case of Pindar, there really was an occasion that he was at for the most part, but Bluesky came up with the idea of pseudo intimacy for Pindar. That is, he makes you feel that you're really there, but in fact, and he tells you some of the local detail, but never enough to baffle you, never enough so that if you weren't there, if you weren't one of the locals, you can't understand his text. His text works is transportable, and you can imagine yourself being there. So it seems intimate. It seems like you're there, but actually it's a kind of pseudo intimacy. Well, in the case of Herodotus, he makes you think that you're there. But the difference in Pindar is that this occasion is an historic one. It's long before he could have been there, and he has to make up all of the details. We can presume that there was this meeting, that the Corinthians opposed it, and maybe a man named Sophocles made this speech, but he has to put this together out of his from his imagination. Well, he gives us access to an occasion, makes us feel as if we're there, makes it clear that he is the mediating factor. How would we describe our relationship with the occasion? In the case of Pindar, scholars are always trying to reconstruct that occasion. In the case of Herodotus, they might try to reconstruct this occasion, but not as one that Herodotus was present at. For Herodotus, his occasions is the mysterious lectures that he might have given in who knows what form. We don't know what relationship those lectures might have borne to the text that we actually have. I want to suggest, this is sort of a takeaway from the talk tonight, that in the case of Herodotus, unlike Pindar, unlike Homer, his text is the occasion. That's what he's invented here. That's the new thing. His text is transportable. It gives us access to historical occasions, but it doesn't have any relationship we can reconstruct to the occasions where he himself personally might have performed. It's only relevant in the most general way to understanding what's going on in Herodotus' text. At the same time, his text breathes the atmosphere of the performance. It's like the booze at these gatherings is a bizarre, dazzling bazaar of wares. So the occasion behind the text is not the point here. The text itself is the occasion, not a window to an occasion is the occasion. I think we can think with some plausibility that this is another thing that Herodotus has invented. So the focus should be what's the experience of this text as we have it. And I think we should abandon, I would plea to abandon all talk of Herodotus being on the cusp of anything or in transition from one place to another or balance between two different things. So what's the experience of the text? To many things one could say, but off the top, clearly one of the big things is the experience of Herodotus himself, the encounter with this amazing figure who's presenting us this book. He creates, as many people have pointed, and Rosiah Munson and Carolyn Duvall developed very nicely in their fantastic recent commentary, creates a dialogic experience with the reader. He shows you his workings. He invites you to disagree with him. He draws you into the text. He makes you think about how history is done, about different sides to arguments, about the function of about historiography, about method, and so on. And I think in the longer term, or in the larger sense, that intellectual engagement, that dialogical engagement is the biggest payoff, the biggest and most important aspect of the experience of this text. But before you sort of get there, or it's more on the surface, I guess, is the encounter with Herodotus as a performer, as a character. I mean, he's an absolute chameleon of a showman, right? He just has so many different guises that, again, this is an aspect of his text, which is has been well explored by commentators. He's a traveler, he's a collector of data, he's a neutral observer, he's an arbiter of truth, he's a theorist. Sometimes he's skeptical, sometimes he's credulous, sometimes he's a eulogist, sometimes he's a scourge, and above all, he's a consummate raconteur. He varies his registers, his style, his pace, everything in order to enliven the text and to suit the immediate purpose of whatever he's doing at that point in the text. It's tremendously varied. Ancient critics talked about this aspect of his variety, and they talked about the pleasure of his text. The sweetness of reading Herodotus is a commonplace. Jessica Priestley has a chapter on this in her book on the Hellenistic reception of Herodotus. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, in his letter to Pompey, says, when we take his book in hand, we are enchanted to the very last syllable. So this is the pleasure of the text, indeed. Well, let's take a look at a couple of sentences. Everybody starts with this one, and why not? So Herodotus of Halicarnassus herewith expounds his research. Well, this heyday, the deictic, has attracted some comment, a lot of comment, and it used to be argued whether it referred to here I am with my performance, that is, it's a relic of his live performance, again, trying to get behind the text to this performative background, or does it refer to the text itself? Well, I want to say you don't have to decide this, right? I mean, if it's obviously performative and it's pointing to something, but if you were to attend a performance and you were to start in this way, you would know right away that he's reading from a text. You would already know too that it's Herodotus of either Thurius or Thurion or Halicarnassus. So, is Herodotus in the text, right? It's the performative Herodotus in the text. Scholars have pointed out the parallel with the so-called speaking inscriptions, where you pass by an inscription that says, this is the same of so-and-so, and the voice speaks out from the stone and buttonholes the passerby. The inscription obliges the passerby to the reader to ventriloquize its speaker, and that as you do that, you become then the origin, the origo, the central point of the deixis. And in a similar way, the reader is drawn into Herodotus's text. The word apodexis, of course, has attracted a lot of comment. resident of epidexis, display oratory, but it's got slightly different nuance. It's not only display, setting forth, and so on, but it's also demonstration. So he's going to show us things, and he's going to show us how he got there. So again, the dialogic relationship is set up right away. Deixis is one way in which he brings the reader into the text. There are many other ways that he can involve us. Some of them are obvious, like second person addresses, but others can be quite subtle. The word tis, one, can be a stand-in for the addressee, the external addressee. Supplementary information is a way of drawing the reader in, addressing the audience. You're explaining something in your text for the benefit of the audience. Those are often introduced by a gar clause. Particles in Greek too can reach out and buttonhole the readers. Particles like kaitoi, mentoi, de, and ara. To that list, one should add the combination men and nun, which you can see here at the beginning of this excerpt, which follows immediately on the poem. Egbert Baker has studied this, and he points out that it occurs hundreds of times in Herodotus, but not at all in Thucydides or Xenophon. It's found in tragedy, but not in comedy. Baker infers that its register is, and I quote, too formal for the comic stage, but too dialogic to be of interest to Thucydides. And he comments further, not only does the element nun point to the discourse's internal present, it also testifies to the speaker's continuous presence. While the Mendesque structure indicates the speaker, quote, guiding the listener or reader through the transitions and exchanges between the many tracks of the histories, transitions which often lead to the historian himself or matters on which he has a strong opinion. So ways in which the reader gets drawn into this text, I've highlighted some of them in this famous opening passage. Person men nun. Now the Persian authorities say, okay, this men nun, listen up, here we go. I'm talking to you. They came originally from the so-called Red Sea. Okay, so-called indicates there's a background conversation I can tell you more about if you're interested. To this sea, our sea, that's a kind of deixis, again, drawing the audience in. You and I are part of the same group. Settling in the place where they still dwell now, that's supplementary information, but which will be familiar to people and appeals to the common knowledge. They apply themselves to long-distance voyages, exporting, voyaging, and then they came to Argos. Argos at this time was preeminent. This is supplementary information. There's a gar in there, I think. No, there isn't, but there's another one. We'll notice that up to then he's been delivering his information in indirect discourse. Here it's direct because he's paused, as it were, to deliver supplementary information. He goes on to tell how Io was kidnapped. And then he says, such is the account the Persians give of how Io came to Egypt, which is not what the Greeks say. And this was the first of the offenses. Thereafter, they say that certain Greeks, they are unable to identify them. This is the Persian logioi, put in at Tyre and carried off Europe, the daughter of the king. These would be Cretans. I can never read this passage without smiling because, parenthesis, they are unable to identify them. And these would be Cretans, delivered in direct discourse, not indirect. And I can't help but bring to mind the image that this conjures up in my mind is of Herodotus delivering his lecture and then pausing, looking up from the lectern, taking his glasses off and saying, these would be Cretans, and then putting his glasses back on, carrying on with the lecture, as it were, right? It's, he set this thing up, right? A lot of people think this whole scenario was invented. That I could say a lot about that too, but that's not the point here tonight. He could have set this up in different ways, but the way he set it up here is that, he's reporting ostensibly exactly what the Persians told him, exactly how much they knew, but their knowledge runs out at certain points, and he, Herodotus, has to step in to help them out, to save them from their sad difficulty. Not only that, but of course, many Greeks in the audience will be thinking, "Well, hang on, I thought that was Zeus, who carried off Europa. You've completely overlooked that. So how does that work? What happened to that kind of story? Do Persians not know about that, or there's just a conundrum about the Persians knowing not only Greek myth but rationalized Greek myth, and so this raises questions of authenticity and reliability and so on and so forth. Which again, I don't want to get into tonight. What I want to say is that this whole thing draws us in and raises this kind of question. It's a dialogic process, not only about content, but about presentation. So every page has got things like this in Herodotus. And time is running on, so I think I'll probably just cut it short there. And say that this cannot really be imagined as the text of an oral performance. It is a written performance which makes us think we're at an oral performance. And he succeeds pretty well. And this is exactly why so much ink has been spilled on trying to reconstruct the oral performances that lay behind text. But I think that is to miss the point. The point is that it's an oral performance as delivered by written text that draws us in. And that is the pleasure of this text. And that is what he has invented, the text as the occasion. His presence in the text takes many forms. He can step back sometimes for long stretches. Other times he's there almost every other sentence. He can be there in different forms and as a first person statement, or in the way he presents the information in direct discourse versus direct discourse, many different devices that make his presence known. He can, like Thucydides, go on for pages. There's lots of stuff written about Thucydides, its vividness, its energeia, and one of the basic points is that it is enhanced by Thucydides drawing back and not making his presence known. The study of his text, of course, shows the artistry at every level, but he's not an overt presence in the text, and this is part of what enables him to present such vivid narrative, and we get drawn into that, forget almost that Thucydides is there. Who others can do that too, but then also he can reinsert himself in dramatic ways at the end of such a stretch, and this is probably the most famous one after the story of Harpagus and Astyages, which has been going on for some pages now without any overt sign of the author's involvement. He says, after this, he gathered up the rest of the flesh and went home, intending, I suppose, to bury it all together. And here's Denniston again to finish. What a marvelous stroke of art is the parenthesis hos ego docio, which transformed the omniscient historian into the spectator, horrified and ignorant of the issue. Then one is too apt to take for granted the reserve and restraint of the classics. I love that. Well, I agree that if the writer, if the narrator is always making his presence known, it can interfere with energeia, with the vividness of the narrative. And yet, on the other hand, when Herodotus pulls a move like this, you realize just what a genius he is as a narrator, right? You are brought up with the staff, and you appreciate his artistry all the more. So, in other words, the text has many ways of drawing you in, other than the pure narrative of a la Thucydides. I think our engagement with the author stands on equal footing with the narrative in Herodotus, and that is the pleasure of his text. Everywhere in Herodotus takes no effort at all to imagine the genial old gaffer telling us all these stories, but that figure is a creation of his text. And I would go so far possibly as to say that in its writtenness, you have the fullest realization of the orality, because writing allows a kind of artfulness that would risk seeming artificial in an oral setting, a true oral setting. So just as virtual reality nowadays can enhance everyday reality, perhaps we could say that virtual orality can surpass its everyday counterpart in some respects. Leave that thought with you, but at any rate, it's only through rereading and contemplation of this text that Herodotus's multifarious voice can truly be appreciated and enjoyed. Thank you.